But God still did not want to abandon them. Instead, he sent generation after generation of prophets and basically preachers into Israel to proclaim to them to return to the covenant and to warn them that there were consequences to the covenant. The covenant would be a great blessing to those who were obedient, but it's a curse to those who are disobedient. And the prophets told them, you must obey, you must return to God, repent. In fact, God knows that he sent the prophets both to Israel and to Judah, but they still did not return to God. They were still in open rebellion. In fact, God says they stiffened their necks. That's a phrase, basically, they got more stubborn. They got more rebellious against God. They hardened their hearts even more than their fathers had. We see here a picture of a nation constantly moving away from God. Instead of returning to him, they are constantly stepping away from God and following after the pagan practices of the neighboring peoples. So, God warned them, you have to turn to me or else there's consequences. And there would be consequences. Look on down to, well, let me read. It's not our focal passage, but we can go ahead and read verse 16. They forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served Baal. The reference to 2 calves is Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, had set up 2 altars in Dan and Bethel, and basically had made molten calves. The molten calf, the calf image was a very much an important symbol in the ancient Near East, and archaeologists have found all sorts of graven images of cows, even in Israel. It was quite a prevalent worship. And these 2 altars were set up in the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Israel to make things more convenient. Because Jeroboam realized if people were returning to Jerusalem to worship, eventually they might think that the Davidic kings were good and restore a unified 12 tribes. So he set up 2 convenient worship locations to make sure that people were not going to Jerusalem. And God makes reference to that in this passage. They also started serving all variety of pagan deities, including Baal, which was one of the most dominant deities. Baal was a storm god. They prayed to him to bring the rain for the crops. Verse 17, and they made their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire and practice divination and enchantments and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him. Again, another important point. They were offering up their children in child sacrifice. It's noted that even several of the kings of Israel engaged in this practice. Even King Ahaz of Israel had engaged in this practice. King Ahaz of Judah had engaged in this practice. And it was one of the things that God detests. But children were being sacrificed. They were engaging in witchcraft and all sorts of pagan beliefs and practices. And God will not tolerate that. So we're back to our focal passage, verse 18. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. And Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs which Israel had introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he cast them out of his sight. What a sad statement. Again, God brought judgment because they were disobedient. And it was all part of it is related to the covenant. Deuteronomy chapter 29 verse 27 says, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land to bring upon it all the curses that are written in this book. And the Lord rooted them out of their land in anger and in wrath and in great indignation and cast them into another land as it is this day. Again, God promised if they were obedient to the covenant, he would bless them. If they were disobedient to the covenant, then it would bring judgment. They had breached the covenant, and they experienced God's wrath. The sad thing is, Judah watched all this, and Judah had prophets to explain, look, Israel is a object lesson for us. See what happened to them? They were disobedient to God. God removed his protection. And that's an important point to understand. It is not just that God brought destruction upon them. Part of it is he removed his protection from them. Israel existed in a very precarious place. Even modern day Israel is on a land bridge between Asia and Africa. And this was the super highway of its day. You had two areas where kingdoms would rise up. Egypt was always a powerful nation, sometimes more powerful than others. And they would cross over Israel to invade into Asia. You had the great Mesopotamian kingdoms centered around modern-day Iran and Iraq. And these massive kingdoms would also want to invade down into Egypt. And so basically Israel was caught between warring superpowers. It was prosperous when it was faithful to God because God protected it from those nations. In fact, at the pinnacle of their obedience under King David, Israel itself became a dominant power in the region. However, when Solomon and Rehoboam sinned against God, their status dropped. And Israel became in a dangerous place. They got to the point where it was really necessary for God to protect them because otherwise they just could not stand against the power of the kingdoms around them. They lacked the money. They lacked the technology. They lacked the leadership that was necessary to contend with these superpowers. So without God's help, there was no way they could survive. And when they rejected God's help, God removed his protection from them and judgment came. But also God brought judgment because it was a requirement of the covenant. God always keeps his word. And God had told them they must keep the covenant or judgment would come. When they broke the covenant, then God would bring judgment upon them. The law required it. God's righteousness requires it. Righteousness requires judgment. God must deal with, by his own nature, must deal with sin and wickedness and must cast out the unrighteous. And that's exactly what he did. He basically erased Israel as a nation from the face of the earth. All that left was Judah, and Judah would not last. Judah lasted about 136 years longer. They continually had prophets, but the people still didn't listen. Now, there are several important things for us to learn from this. It's more than just a history lesson. Again, it shows God is in control of politics and the workings of nations. Even today, God is at work on the world stage, often in ways that we don't immediately recognize or understand, but we can take confidence that God is in control, and everything that happens will be done to bring about his will. He still brings judgment upon nations, and he still exalts nations that are obedient to him. But God is in control. But one of the important things we can learn from this is don't let the world's culture shape us and our beliefs. Syncretism, that is the blending of beliefs between what is righteous and what is unrighteous, has always been a problem. It was a problem with Israel, it was a problem with the early church, and it's a problem with modern church. We don't want to accept the beliefs and the worldview of the world. We want to accept God. We want to accept his view and what he defines as righteousness. Those that compromise allow sin to come into the door. We cannot compromise with a sinful culture. It does not open the doors to make us more popular. All it does is it pushes us farther away from God. We are to trust in God, not in man. The Israelites did not trust in God. They trusted in political alliances. They trusted in their own abilities, their own cunning, their own wealth, their own successes, but they did not trust in God. Judah had the same problem. King Ahaz saw the Assyrians approach at one point after he broke off his alliance with them, and they were going to invade, and Isaiah came to him and says, God's not going to let the Assyrians conquer. Trust in God and don't worry. And Ahaz didn't. Ahaz kind of brushed Isaiah off, and Isaiah said, ask for a sign. And Ahaz says, I'm not going to tempt God. It wasn't that he was trying to be pious, it was that he did not believe in the God of Isaiah. And And Isaiah gave a prophecy, and it came true. And Assyria was defeated. And it was clear that it was not by human ability that Assyria was defeated. It was a thing of God. God is still in control. We can still rely upon God in every situation. We should trust God. Don't lean upon man's understanding. Trust in God instead. Our salvation is not dependent upon obedience to the law. And that's an important point. We are saved by grace. The law, Paul teaches us in Galatians, that the law is like a school teacher. The law demonstrates to us, it shows us what righteousness is, but the law in and of itself cannot save us. In fact, if we rely totally on the law, it does more to condemn us than to save us, because it forces us to rely upon ourselves rather than rely upon God. The law shows us what is right, but it is grace that makes us right. It is the grace provided through salvation in Jesus Christ that saves us. So why bother with the law? The law still demonstrates what righteousness is, and those who trust in God want to pursue righteousness. We want to be faithful believers in God. We want to be the good children of God and follow after Jesus. We want to be obedient to the commands of Jesus and follow after him. And those who are Christians are going to want to live a righteous life. Sometimes it takes some discernment how to apply that in our everyday situations, but still, Christ wants to guide us into a righteous relationship with God the Father. So, being obedient to the law does not save us. However, obedience to the law of God, demonstrates our faith to God and is part of what it means to be a righteous child of God. Now, having said that, it's also important to note that while salvation does not depend upon obedience to the law, we have to be obedient to the law, and if we're not obedient to the law, it's not going to bring the same type of judgment. However, we will experience discipline. God disciplined Israel because they broke the covenant. Proverbs 3:12 says, "For whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects a son in whom he delights." God's going to correct and help those who belong to him. And sometimes discipline is not always a pleasant thing. Discipline can be extremely unpleasant, especially the farther you get out of line, the more discipline that God is going to bring upon you. And also, we see this even in the New Testament. It's repeated in many places, but one is Revelation 3:19. Jesus says, "Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. Therefore be zealous and repent." So God still disciplines his children. God disciplines those whom he loves. The idea of discipline is distasteful, but at the same time, discipline brings us back into the line of where we should be. God still disciplines his children. God will still discipline the church today. It's not going to be with capture and exile necessarily as a nation, but certainly God can remove his protective hand at times to bring upon difficult situations so that his people will repent. God's still in control. God disciplines his children.